Good day. So I had to do some work on my Chevy LS. It's a 2014 Suburban, which is the last year of that model Suburban before they switched to the next one. And I believe it lines up engine-wise with the 2013, up to 2013 pickup trucks from like '06 or '07. The Suburban Tahoe Yukon line, I believe, was '07 to '14, the same model that I'm showing here. It's got the Active Fuel Management or Displacement on Demand system, where 4 of the cylinders, I believe it's 1, 4, 6, and 7, are use those DoD lifters that are designed to basically to collapse or not, to be stiff or not, depending on the way it funnels oil pressure. Essentially, I was having some misfires. I tackled the coil issue. You can swap one coil to another cylinder. You can swap the spark plug to yet a different cylinder. You can swap the plug wire to yet a different cylinder and then fire it up and see if the code pops up on the same cylinder. Mine was on cylinder 1, and swapping things around didn't result in anything different. So I went ahead and decided to do it in the winter, which was not great. It took me like 2 months because some of the days it was just below zero in the garage, and I didn't want to be out there doing that. So, but I went ahead. I watched a lot of videos. I wanted to roll in some of the tips and tricks that I found helpful that not all of the videos included. So that's what you're going to see here. So hopefully it's fairly short, but essentially I'm going to go through and just highlight some of the things that I found really helpful. I also have 2 GM line mechanics that I talked to along the way for some tips as well. So I'm going to include their advice as well. So this is about what it looked like when I pulled the head off and wiggled the gasket. So you can see there's a little bit of buildup, especially around the ring of the cylinder, as well as on the bolt points, and just in several spots along the way. So definitely want to clean that up.
While cleaning the head, recommend using a razor blade. You can buy them in a pack with a whole bunch of them like this. And what I learned is you can basically hold the blade straight up like this and scrape it gently and slowly, and just work your way around like so, each of the cylinders. And what you're doing here is you're cleaning this ring without scratching or scuffing. If you scrape like this, you can cut into this and tear it, especially the aluminum blocks. You can cause all sorts of damage, and then you'd have a leaking head gasket, and that's no good. So that's one tip there. I also used nylon bristles on a drill to get some of this cleared off, because there's a lot of residue from the gasket on there, and a brake cleaner spray bottle. Also notice I pulled these out, and that allowed me to get this nice and smooth. When you run your finger over this, what you really want is you want it to feel smooth. And you can go ahead and do that same check over all of the grooves. And basically, if you feel any rough spot, like where this rough coating from in here is kind of peeling up around it, you can scrape at that with that blade. Again, these little blade holders, this was like $3 at AutoZone. Easier to grab it. But I would make sure, if you're going to do this, especially for this firing edge, I changed out blades like every cylinder basically. Buy a box of 100 of them. They're real cheap. When you pull these out, this is this little ring that basically is just here to hold in place the head and the gasket while you're installing it. It's really handy. But notice it's got a groove on it. You can just pinch it with pliers around the side like so, and it'll wiggle itself out. And to get them back in, it's always better to have them on the block than the head. You can just set it in there, find a way that it goes kind of nicely, and then you can tap it in with a hammer real gently. Let's see here. You don't need to get it in far. You just need to get it, you'll feel it set, and that's plenty. So anyways, that's to help clean up the head in here. I'll let you know at the end how it performs.
You can see how dirty the pistons are as well, and some were worse than others. They were all pretty bad. So I did clean these out. Now, one thing I did use for a good chunk of it, that got a lot of it, especially around the edges, was I used a nylon bristled brush that I could put on my drill. And so I'd turn the engine crank so that the cylinder or the piston sat lower in the cylinder. That way I wasn't making as much of a splashing mess. Then I was able to spray all sorts of brake cleaner in there and then get that nylon in there and get it spinning pretty good. And that didn't damage the cylinder walls and also managed to clean up at least some of the grit off of the pistons themselves, but some of them were a lot worse than others. So I actually did pull them all the way up to the top at some point and scraped them with a razor blade. I was trying to be real careful with this, knowing that, of course, a little nick in the piston surface isn't going to be as catastrophic as something along like where the head gasket surface is, because you're not going to develop a leak inside there. So you can rough it up a little bit, but I really didn't want to damage anything. I didn't want to go that far. I'm just trying to do the top end of the engine here. So I did use the razor blade to scrape off all the smooth surfaces, a little bit into the valve divots, but then once I'd get that scraped off pretty well, then I'd scrub at it with a nylon brush. I've really tried not to use the steel wire brushes, so I'd use that nylon brush with the brake cleaner to try and get the rest of the parts that I hadn't gotten yet. So, and of course, it's not extremely crucial that you have a nice clean piston. Honestly, it's probably more of a pride thing for, here I'm taking pictures of it and showing my project, and it sure looked a lot better when I put it back together than it did when I took it apart. But yeah, I wanted to get some of the buildup off of there as best I could.
So one bit of advice I had to keep your valve rail in place was, you can take all the pieces off here. I had my push rods out. I had this little tray out. Just set it back in. I just took a look here. Saw the suggestion of marking out, here, driver's side. Here's the front, all the way to the back, so you keep these in the same position. Well, this cardboard trick was an idea I saw, which looked nice, so things wouldn't get out of track. But one thing I don't like so much about it is, you see all that fuzz? So I'm gonna go ahead and clean that off, but I no longer recommend this technique because it's making me have to do a little bit of extra work. So make sure things like that are cleaned off. That's probably not the worst of it. It's not like I've got metal shavings down in a cylinder or something, or along a lifter, but something you should think about when you're finding a place to put these things. Okay, so dealing with the rocker arm assembly here, I had the cardboard on here. I went ahead and just wiped it with a paper towel and then used my air gun to zap it off. And then I saw many recommendations on videos to basically start by putting one in on one side and then reach to the far side and work your way back. Basically that one to hold it down. But I've been putting in this assembly lube under both sides of this. And just a reminder to do these in order, like to put them right back where you got them. Really, it's the wear pattern on this right here is what they say could be inconsistent between them, and you want to keep it on the same valve. So I just put my first one on, and then I'm working my way around. And of course, you want to make sure you get that little slot on your push rod. Saw many recommendations through other YouTube videos on push rods. So what I did with mine is I shot a spray of carb cleaner through each one. Obviously not in the engine here, off to the side. And then I dipped the tip of it in motor oil and shot it straight in there. And then of course, as I put this assembly lube in here, you can see the dot working up here of that lube. And then they're gonna be really loose until the rounded part on this gets settled into the groove on this as you torque it down. And I've got this other side already torqued down. And what I did with that is, you can see some of them are extended from the cam pressure. But basically what I did is I hand tightened all of them, with a ratchet, but just not very tight. And then I turned the engine, and as I saw valves go down and then up, I made sure that a pair for one cylinder, both of them were all the way up. So once it stopped up and then a second further, and then I went ahead and torqued them down to the 22. Then I rotated it until I saw the next one settle into that fully relaxed position where the spring's all the way up. And then I torqued those ones down to 22 pound-feet and on down until I got all 4 cylinders taken care of. So working on this one right now. Again, I started with one here, and I've got working my way back this way as I finish that up. So now that I get everything torqued down on this valve train, I saw some of the videos. Just got some regular motor oil here. Just gonna pour it down in here just to help get everything a little bit extra lubed, because you can never have it too lubed, right? And plus, I want to change the oil before I fire it up, and assuming that I got some impurities in there from having it all exposed. So my hope is that this will kind of rinse some of that down into the pan so that I can take care of it. But this way, I did see some videos where they put some assembly lube right here. I think that's called the trunnion, basically the bearing portion of the rocker arm. And so instead of doing that, I'm just gonna cover it with oil. These are the factory trunnions. You can see right there how it rocks right inside there. But yeah, so I'll do that to both sides. So I'm getting my intake manifold back in here.
And to get it in without messing anything up, you definitely need to take the bolts out. They're really easy to feed back in. So I definitely recommend taking the bolts, even though they're captured. Take them out of the intake manifold before you wiggle it in.
I had the different gaskets with a little bolt cover here that slips over that bolt, and one back further back, instead of clipping right here under the end of the manifold. But also, just a note, we were working on this wiring harness is obnoxiously in the way. So I'd recommend, I zip tied it to here. I've seen people zip tie it up a little higher. You can see it goes back here. I'm gonna have to get it around front. There's these channels right here that parts of it go under. And so you see this wire right here. These two pieces, they're gonna snake around. One of them will cut through here, one of them over through this slot here, and they're gonna snake right up under here and here. And I'm gonna put this little panel over the top, which holds those down. Also, don't forget, there is a clip hanging around back here on the back left. Right there. Make sure we get that clipped into the appropriate spot as we get her in here. But that's that for now. All right, so I just got my intake manifold in, and there's a note I wanted to suggest. So I took this wiring harness here, all the mess, I haven't finished routing it through here yet, but I had zip tied it up here to this, as well as this right here, and that got it out of the way so I could deal with my head. But also I noted some of these, the plastic here is really brittle and it's just crumbling off into little pieces. So I wanted to keep that clear so nothing dropped into my engine block or anything like that. Also, I had some wires that I had tied up around the transmission dipstick here. So some of these wires you can see here, including one of these plugs. And this is just one of the fuel injector plugs. You can see there's several down this train here that are all the same. So I'm gonna work on feeding that guy back through the right way.
So those are the big tips that a lot of the videos that I saw had kind of left out, or only a few of them alluded to. But I am going to point out a few extra things that I bumped into along the way, and hopefully they'll help you in case you bump into something like that along the way as well. So I sheared off one of my exhaust manifold bolts. From what I gather, this is not a rare thing. Mine was the very furthest one towards the firewall on the driver's side. I chewed on it for a while and I was going to deal with it because I didn't want to make a mess of the head. But what I ended up doing is I got this kit from a company called Freedom Racing is where I bought it. But it's a Lyle kit, and here it is. And this is specifically designed for LS heads. You can see it's got all the tools you need in here. Some instructions. This bolts in where the manifold bolts in, so you can basically hold it in place. You've got small drill bits and you can increase in size as you go. You got the spacers that help keep it in place. You've got this spacer to make sure that you're not drilling in too far, so you can set your drill bit to the right 1.5 depth so that you're not drilling into your cylinder head beyond the bolt. So great, very, very useful tool set. I definitely recommend it. I want to say I paid about $120 for this set. I did see some other ones online, even with some videos that showed how to use it, that were in the $300 range. So I've searched a little further, found this one that turned out to be exactly comparable and did a great job for me. So I recommend it. I bought my gaskets on eBay. It was $109, I think, for the whole set. It's a very comprehensive set. It has tons of gaskets. You could do the timing chain cover. Honestly, you could probably do pretty much a full rebuild with all the gaskets that they got. So I only used what I needed for how deep that I went, except when I saw the head gaskets, they weren't marked where the front was or where the back was like most of the ones I'd seen in the videos. I chewed on whether I should use them or not, and in the end, I decided to go ahead and go to the local GM dealer. I think it was $50 a gasket, so another $100 that I went ahead and spent because I'd rather get the head gasket right. And some of the valve cover gaskets, whatever, those are small and cheap, easy to replace again, but I didn't want to have to do all this again. So here's the factory ones that I ended up getting instead. Yeah, that was with some advice granted from a GM employee who recommended basically if it was my truck, I would use the factory or the OEM. So I went ahead and went with that. Now maybe this is a product of using those cheaper gaskets, but when I was putting the driver's side exhaust manifold back on, I had the hardest time trying to get this one bolt started. This is that middle gap where you've got two bolts on the exhaust manifold instead of just one in the gap. And you can see here the gasket actually is not quite cut right and doesn't let you put another bolt in there. So I'm running it without this bolt, and honestly I don't hear an exhaust leak at all, so I'm totally satisfied to just leave it. But I had the hardest time trying to cram it in there. I was worrying I was stripping bolts and whatnot, and then I was able to get my camera in there to get a picture, and it turns out the gasket just isn't really cut right. So it's probably the product of using the cheaper gaskets rather than going OEM or with a higher end. So just a note there. I went ahead and ran without it, and so far so good. So none of the videos that I saw covered putting the dipstick tube back in. So the picture that you're seeing here is the hole where the tube goes. And this is from the wheel well. So I've got my phone actually crammed in, and I used a little technology trick here. So I used my phone, I crammed it in between the tire and the fender lining, and just off the stock, everything, it managed to just kind of fit where it would see that image. Then what I did is I used my Apple Watch connected to the phone using the camera app, where you can use the watch to push the button on the camera, where you can actually see the viewfinder of what the camera is seeing. So while I was above, I'm looking at my wrist, wiggling this thing in there, and I can see where I need to move it in order to slide it into that tube. And once I get it in the tube, kind of a little bit of a twist and jiggle to get it popped in all the way, and then bolted onto the head where it goes. And I took pictures before I did any of the teardown, and those were very helpful in figuring out what bolt holes to use for which in cases like this. But it's kind of a trick. If you have someone else that you can get to look, shine a flashlight and to look into this spot here, it can work. I did that once, and then I was worried that I fed it through the wrong gap in the exhaust header. So I went ahead and pulled it out and wiggled it and finagled it, and then ended up doing it again the way I described with the phone. So just a thought, it does work that way. It's a little tricky, but you can certainly do it with somebody guiding you in and telling you, when to go, towards the engine, up a little bit more. Okay, now in, kind of thing. So it's a trick. All right, so we've got it all back together. So we're going to take a look at what happens. Yeah, I know I didn't clean anything, any of the plastic pieces, but it should run great. Just doesn't look all that great.
See what happens.
So it did run. That's good. I cycled the key on a few times on and off to try and get pressure on the fuel lines, and it worked just fine. You heard it. That was the first time I turned it over. As we get over here, especially closer into the valve cover, you hear a bit of knocking, and that definitely pulls out. And oil penetrated the system a little bit more. So that's that. Since I got it all back together, I've put about 600 miles or so on the Suburban. I did run about a half a quart of transmission fluid in with that first bit of oil. So after I changed, I did everything, got it all back together. Before I started it up, I went ahead and changed the oil. I left the old filter, figuring I wanted it to run a little bit and capture a few more nasties before I then gave it a good one. But I did run, when I changed it, before I started it, I put some transmission fluid in it, just a half a quart, and then drove it maybe 200 or so miles, and then I changed the oil again. So the idea here was just, rinse everything out and get another good oil change in there so that I have good oil in there, good filter, and now I'll be on the regular, 3,000-ish mile cycle, and hopefully not run into any problems with the lifters anymore. Thanks for watching Wrong Guy for the Job. I hope this was useful, and enjoy. We'll see you on the next project.